Verne. Translated by Agnes D. Kingston. Book 2, Chapter 2. Matthias van Guit. At daybreak of the 26th of June, the jovial tones of a well-known voice aroused me from my slumbers. Captain Hood and his man Fox were engaged in lively conversation in the dining-room, where I soon joined them. At the same moment Banks made his appearance, upon which the captain greeted him with, "Well, Banks, here we are at last, arrived in safety. It's a positive halt this time, not a mere stoppage for an hour or two, but a stay of some months." "Very true, my dear Hood," replied the engineer. "Now you can arrange your hunting excursions as you please. Behemoth's whistle won't hurry you back to camp." "Do you hear, Fox?" "Aye, aye, Captain," answered the man. "St. Hubert be my speed!" cried Hood. "I vow I won't leave this sanitarium, as you call it, until the 50th is added to my list. The 50th, Fox! I have an idea that fellow will be particularly hard to get hold of." "He will be got, though," put in Fox. "What has put that idea into your head, Captain?" I asked. "Oh, Mauclair, it is merely a presentiment, a sportsman's presentiment, nothing more." "Well, then," said Banks, "from today I suppose you will leave the encampment to commence the campaign?" "From today," answered Captain Hood, "we shall begin by reconnoitring the ground, so as to explore the lower zone, by descending into the Terai, provided the tigers have not abandoned their residences." "Can you imagine such a thing?" "Remember my bad luck." "Bad luck? In the Himalayas?" returned the engineer. "Would that be possible?" "Well, we shall see." "You will accompany us, Mauclair?" asked Captain Hood, turning to me. "Yes, certainly." "And you, Banks?" "I also," replied the engineer. "And I fancy, too, that Munro will join you, like myself, as an amateur." "Oh," returned Hood, "come as amateurs if you like, but you must be amateurs well armed. It would never do to walk about with nothing but sticks in your hands. The very wild beasts would hide themselves for shame." "Agreed, then," said the engineer. "Now, Fox," continued the captain, addressing his servant, "no mistakes this time, please. We are in the tiger country. 4 Enfield rifles for the colonel, Mr. Banks, Monsieur Mauclair, and myself. 2 guns loaded with explosive ball for yourself and Gomi." "Don't be afraid, Captain," replied Fox. "The game shan't have any reason to complain, I warrant you." This day was to be devoted to reconnoitering the forest which clothed the lower part of the Himalayas, below our sanitarium. About 11 o'clock, therefore, Sir Edward Munro, Banks, Hood, Fox, Gomi, and myself, all well armed, descended the road which slanted towards the plain, taking care to leave behind our 2 dogs, whose services were not required in an expedition of this sort. Sergeant McNeill remained in camp with Storr, Caluth, and the cook, to complete the arrangements. After this 2 months' journey, Behemoth required to be examined both inside and out, cleaned, and put in order. This was, of course, a long, minute, and delicate operation, which would give his usual keepers, the driver and stoker, occupation for some time. Soon after leaving our camp, a turn in the road quite hid the steam-house, which disappeared from our sight behind a thick curtain of trees. It no longer rained. A fresh wind blew from the northeast, driving the hurrying clouds before it. The sky was overcast, and the temperature, consequently, suitable for pedestrians, but we missed the pretty variations of light and shade which add such a charm to woodland scenery. 6,000 feet down a direct road would have been but an affair of 25 or 30 minutes, but it was lengthened by the windings it took to avoid steep places. It took us not less than an hour and a half to reach the outskirts of the forest, but we all enjoyed the walk. "Attention!" exclaimed Captain Hood. We are now entering the domain of tigers, lions, panthers, leopards, and other interesting inhabitants of the Himalayan region. It is very exciting to destroy wild beasts, but it wouldn't be quite so pleasant to be destroyed by them. Therefore, do not stray away from each other, and be prudent." Such advice from the lips of so bold a hunter was of considerable value, and we respected it accordingly. We all looked to the loading of our guns, and kept our eyes open. I may add that we not only had to be on our guard against wild beasts, but against serpents also, as the most dangerous of their species infest the Indian forests. Belongas, green serpents, whip-snakes are frightfully venomous. The number of victims who succumb annually to the bite of these reptiles is 5 or 6 times greater than that of domestic animals or human beings who are killed by wild beasts. In this region it was no more than the commonest prudence required to look where you set your foot or placed your hand, to keep your eyes open for the slightest rustle in the grass or bushes, and your eyes as much as possible everywhere at once. At 12:30 we were well into the forest. The great trees formed wide alleys through which even Behemoth and his train might have passed with ease. Indeed, this part of the forest had been partially cleared by the hillmen, as we ascertained from the marks their carts had left in the soft, clayey ground. The principal alleys ran parallel with the mountain chain, along the greatest length of the Terai, connecting the glade formed by the woodman's axe, and with more narrow paths which led off from them, and ended in impenetrable thickets. We followed these avenues, more like surveyors than sportsmen, so as to ascertain their general direction. No roar or scream broke the silence of the woods, but great footprints, plainly recent, showed that wild beasts had not deserted the Terai. Suddenly, just as we were turning an angle formed by the hill, an exclamation from Captain Hood brought us all to a standstill. 20 paces from us was a construction most peculiar in its shape. It was not a house, for it had neither chimney nor windows. It was not a hunter's lodge, for it had neither loopholes nor embrasures. It might rather have been taken for a native tomb, lost in the depths of the forest. Imagine a sort of long cube, formed of trunks placed vertically side by side, fixed firmly in the ground, and connected with the upper part by a thick border of boughs. For a roof, other transverse trunks were strongly mortised into the walls. Evidently, the builder of this edifice had determined to make it proof against anything. It was nearly 6 feet high, and 12 feet by 5 in length and width. There was no sign of any opening, unless one was hidden by a thick beam, of which the rounded top rose a little above the rest of the building. Above the roof were several long, flexible tendrils, curiously arranged and tied together. At the extremity of a horizontal lever, which supported all this, hung a running knot, or rather noose, made of a thick twist of creepers. "Hullo, what's that?" I exclaimed. "That," answered Banks, after examining it well, "is simply a mousetrap, and I leave you, my friends, to guess what sort of mice it is destined to catch." "A tiger trap?" asked Hood. "Yes," replied Banks, "a tiger trap. You see, the door is closed by that beam, which was kept up by those tendrils, and which must have dropped when the inner weight was touched by some animal." "It is the first time," said Hood, "that I ever saw a snare of that kind in an Indian forest. A mousetrap indeed, but it isn't worthy of a sportsman." "Nor of a tiger," added Fox. "No doubt," said Banks, "but when it is a question of destroying these ferocious animals, and not merely hunting them for pleasure, the best trap is the one which catches most. Now this appears to me most ingeniously arranged, to attract and detain wild creatures, however sly and strong they may be." "Allow me to remark, my friends," said Colonel Munro, "that since the equilibrium of the weight which holds back the door of the trap has been disturbed, the probability is that some animal is taken in it." "We shall soon know that," cried Captain Hood, "and if the mouse is not dead—" The captain, giving force to his words, put his gun at full cock. All followed his example. We had no doubt now that the erection before us was a trap, which, if it was not the work of a native, at any rate was a very practical engine of destruction, being extremely sensitive and uncommonly strong. Our arrangements made, Captain Hood, Fox, and Gumi approached and marched around the snare, examining it minutely. Not the smallest chink, however, gave them the least glimpse into the interior. They listened attentively. Not a sound betrayed the presence of any living creature. All was silent as the grave. Hood and his companions came round again to the front. They ascertained that the beam slid up and down in 2 wide vertical grooves. It was only necessary, therefore, to raise this, and the entrance would be open. "There's not the slightest sound," said Captain Hood, with his ear close against the door. "Not even a breath. The mouse-trap is empty." "Never mind that. You must be careful." And saying this, Colonel Munro seated himself on the trunk of a fallen tree to the left of the clearing. I placed myself beside him. "Come, Gumi," said the captain. Gumi, with his supple, well-knit frame, active as a monkey, lithe as a leopard, a regular native acrobat, understood directly what was required of him. His natural adroitness designed him for the service the captain wished done. One spring and he was on the roof, and grasping one of the rods. Then he crept along the lever till he reached the rope of creepers, and by his weight brought it down to the beam which closed the opening. The loop was then passed over the head of the beam in a notch made for the purpose. All that now remained to be done was to move it by weighing down the other end of the lever. The united strength of our little party was required for this, so Colonel Munro, Banks, Fox, and I proceeded to the back of the trap. Gumi remained on the roof to look after the lever, in case anything prevented it from working freely. "I say, you fellows," shouted Captain Hood, "if you want me, I will come, but if you can do without me, I would prefer to stop where I am, near the opening. If a tiger pops out, he shall be saluted with 1 shot, at any rate." "And will that count for your 42nd?" asked I. "Why not?" answered Hood. "If I shoot him, he will have fallen in freedom." "Don't count your chickens before they are hatched," said the engineer. "Especially when the chicken may turn out to be a tiger," added the colonel. "Now, my friends," cried Banks, "all together." The beam was heavy, and did not run easily in the grooves. We managed, however, to move it just a foot from the ground, but then it stuck. Captain Hood, with his gun at full cock, bent down, expecting to see some huge paw or nose poking out. Nothing was to be seen. "Once more!" cried Banks. Gumi now gave a jerk or two to the lever, and the beam again moved up. Gradually the opening became large enough to give passage even to an animal of great size. But no creature of any description appeared. It was possible, after all, that, owing to the noise made around the trap, the prisoner might have retreated into the farthest corner of his prison. He might perhaps be waiting for a favorable opportunity to spring out, overturn anything that opposed him, and disappear in the depths of the forest. It was very exciting. At last I saw Captain Hood step forward, his finger on the trigger, and cast a keen glance into the interior of the snare. The beam was by this time completely raised, and the sunlight streamed freely into the building. At that moment a slight rustle was heard inside, then a great snore, or rather a tremendous yawn which had a very suspicious sound. Evidently an animal was in there, which had been fast asleep and was now awakening. Captain Hood advanced still nearer, and pointed his gun at a dark object which he now saw moving in a corner. Suddenly a cry of terror burst forth, followed immediately by these words, spoken in good English. "Don't fire! For heaven's sake, don't fire!" The man who uttered them ran out. Our astonishment was such that our hands left their grasp of the lever, and the beam fell again with a dull sound before the opening. In the meantime, the personage who had so unexpectedly made his appearance came up to Captain Hood, whose gun was aimed full at the stranger's breast, and in a somewhat affected tone, accompanied by an emphatic gesture, "I beg you will lower your weapon, sir," he said. "It is no tiger that you have to deal with." Captain Hood, after some hesitation, returned his rifle to a less threatening position. "Whom have I the honor of addressing?" asked Banks, advancing in his turn. "The naturalist Matthias van Gwiet, purveyor of pachydermata, tardigrades, plantigrades, proboscidate animals, carnivora, and other mammalia for the house of Mr. Charles Rice of London and Messrs. Hagenbeek of Hamburg." Then, indicating us by a comprehensive wave of the arm, "These gentlemen?" "Are Colonel Munro and his travelling companions," answered Banks. "Taking a walk in the Himalayan forest," resumed the purveyor. "A charming excursion indeed. I am happy to pay my respects to you, gentlemen." Who could this original be, whom we had met in such a strange way? He looked rather as if his wits had gone astray during his imprisonment in the tiger trap. Was he mad, or was he in possession of his senses? Lastly, to what order of Bimina did this individual belong? We were about to ascertain all this, and we were destined eventually to learn to know well this singular person, who with perfect truth termed himself a naturalist. Matthias van Gwiet, menagerie purveyor, was a spectacled man of about 50. His smooth face, his twinkling eyes, his turned-up nose, the perpetual stir of his whole person, his exaggerated gestures, suited to each of the sentences which issued from his wide mouth, all combined to make him a perfect type of the old provincial comedian. Who has not, at some time or another, met one of these ancient actors, whose whole existence, limited by a horizon of foot-lamps and drop-scene, has been passed between the green-room and stage of a theatre? Indefatigable talkers, worrying gesticulators, always striking some theatrical attitude or other, and the head, which is too empty at old age to have ever had much in it, carried high in air and thrown a little back. There was certainly something of the old actor in Matthias van Gwiet. I have heard an amusing anecdote about a poor wretch of a singer, who prided himself on always suiting his actions to the words of his part. Thus, in the opera of Masaniello, when he sung, "If of a Neapolitan fisher," his right arm, extended towards the audience, would shake as if he held at the end of a line the fish which had just swallowed his hook. Then continuing, "Heaven wished to make a monarch," whilst one hand was raised towards the roof to indicate heaven, the other, tracing a circle around his proudly set head, denoted a royal crown. "Rebelling against the decrees of destiny," his whole body seemed strongly to resist some unseen agency which almost threw him backwards. "He would say as he steered his bark." Then his two arms, quickly brought from left to right, and from right to left, as if moving the skull, showing his skill in guiding a boat. Well, these gestures, customary with the singer in question, were very similar to those used by Matthias van Gwiet. His language was always composed of the choicest terms, and he was sometimes rather annoying to his interlocutors, if they could not keep beyond the radius of his gestures. As we learnt later, from his own mouth, Matthias van Gwiet was formerly professor of natural history in the Rotterdam Museum, but did not succeed in his teaching. The worthy man was doubtless a subject for much laughter, and though pupils flocked to his chair, it was to amuse themselves, not to learn. In short, circumstances induced him to leave his wearisome, unsuccessful teaching of theoretical zoology, and to take to practical zoology in the East Indies. This sort of trade suited him better, and he became the agent of important firms in London and Hamburg, who provide both public and private menageries in the two worlds. A large order from Europe for wild beasts had now brought him into the Terai. Indeed, his camp was not more than a couple of miles from the trap out of which we had just extricated him. But how had the purveyor got into the snare? This Banks soon asked, and the reply was made in high-flown language, adorned with various gestures. "It was yesterday. Already had the sun completed half its daily round, when the thought occurred to me that I would go and visit one of the tiger traps erected in the forest. I therefore quitted my kraal, which I trust you will honor with a visit, gentlemen, and soon reached this clearing. My servants were attending to some urgent work, and I did not wish to disturb them. It was imprudent, I confess. When I arrived before this snare, I observed that the movable beam was raised. From this I drew the logical conclusion that no wild animal had allowed itself to be taken in it. However, wishing to ascertain if the bait was still in its place, and if the working of the weight was in good order, I, with a quick movement, insinuated my body through the narrow aperture." Here the hand of Matthias van Gwiet imitated the graceful undulations of a serpent as it glides through the long grass. "When I reached the other side of the trap," he continued, "I examined the quarter of a goat, the emanations from which were to attract guests to partake of it from this part of the forest. The bait was intact. I was about to withdraw, when an involuntary blow from my arm displaced the weight. The rope became loose, the beam fell, and I found myself taken in my own snare, without any possible means of escape." Matthias van Gwiet paused a moment to allow us to take in all the gravity of the situation. "Yet, gentlemen," he resumed, "I will not conceal from you that I was first of all struck by the comic view of the matter. I was imprisoned, well. There was no jailer to open the door of my dungeon, granted. But I thought indeed that my people, finding that I did not reappear at the kraal, would become uneasy at my prolonged absence and commence a search which sooner or later would end in my being discovered. It was but an affair of time. Stone walls do not a prison make, nor iron bars a cage. Minds innocent and quiet take that for an hermitage." I consoled myself with these thoughts, and the hours passed away without anything occurring to modify my situation. The shades of evening fell, and pangs of hunger made themselves felt. I imagined the best thing I could do would be to cheat time by sleeping. I resigned myself then philosophically, and was soon in the arms of Morpheus. The night was calm, and silence reigned throughout the forest. Nothing troubled my slumber, and perhaps I should even now be oblivious, if it had not been that I was awakened by an unusual noise. The door of the trap rose slowly. The blessed light of day streamed into my darksome retreat. The way of escape was open before me. What was my dismay when I perceived the instrument of death aimed full at my heart! A moment more, and I should have been stretched lifeless on the ground. The hour of my deliverance would have been the last of my life. But the gallant captain soon recognized in me a creature of his own species, and I have still to thank you, gentlemen, for having restored to me my liberty." Such was our new friend's account of himself. It must be acknowledged that we had some difficulty in keeping our gravity, so absurd were his tone and gestures. "So, sir," said Banks, "your camp is established in this part of the Terai?" "Yes, sir," replied Matthias van Gwiet. "As I had the pleasure of informing you, my kraal is not more than 2 miles from here, and if you will honor it with your presence, I shall be happy to receive you there." "Certainly, Mr. van Gwiet," answered Colonel Munro. "We will come and pay you a visit." "We are hunters," added the captain, "and the arrangements of a kraal will interest us." "Hunters!" cried Matthias van Gwiet. "Hunters!" And his countenance betrayed that he held the sons of Nimrod in very moderate estimation. "You hunt wild beasts for the sake of killing them, doubtless," he resumed, addressing the captain. "Only to kill them," replied Hood. "And I only to catch them," answered the purveyor with evident pride. "Well, Mr. Van Gwyt, we shan't agree upon that point," said Captain Hood. The purveyor shook his head. The discovery of our hunting propensities was not, however, of importance enough to make him withdraw his invitation. "When you are ready to follow me, gentlemen," he said, bowing gracefully. But as he spoke, voices were heard in the distance, and very soon half a dozen natives appeared at the other end of the glade. "Ah, here are my people," said Van Gwyt. Then, approaching us closer and placing his finger on his lips, "Not a word of my adventure," he whispered. "The attendants and servants of the kraal must not know that I have been caught in my own trap like some common animal. It would lessen the reputation for wisdom which I endeavour to preserve in their eyes." Our sign of acquiescence reassured the purveyor. "Master," said one of the natives, whose impassible and intelligent countenance attracted my attention, "Master, we have been searching for you for more than an hour, without—" "I was with these gentlemen, who wished to accompany me to the kraal," answered Van Gwyt. "But before quitting the clearing, the trap must be put in order." Whilst the natives were proceeding to obey their master's orders, Matthias Van Gwyt invited us to visit the interior of the trap. Captain Hood entered with alacrity, and I followed. The space was somewhat limited for the display of our host's gestures, but he nevertheless did the honours as though it were a drawing-room. "I congratulate you," said Hood after examining the apparatus. "It is exceedingly well contrived." "I do not hesitate to say that it is, Captain," replied Van Gwyt. "This description of snare is infinitely preferable to the ditches set with stakes of hardened wood, or the flexible branches of trees bent together so as to form a running knot. In the first case, the animal is impaled on the sharp points. In the second, it is strangled. That, of course, matters little when the object is merely to kill and destroy, but I, who now speak to you, must procure the living creature intact, with not the slightest blemish." "Certainly," said Captain Hood. "We do not proceed in the same way." "Mine is perhaps the best," said the purveyor. "If you were to consult the animals themselves—" "But I have no intention of consulting them," replied the captain. Matthias Van Gwyt and Captain Hood would have some trouble in getting on together, most decidedly. "Now, when the animals are caught in the trap," I asked, "what do you do next?" "A rolling cage is brought close to the trap," replied Van Gwyt. "The prisoners run into it of their own accord, and then all I have to do is to convey them to the kraal, drawn at a slow and steady pace by my domestic buffaloes." Scarcely were these words uttered when cries arose outside. Captain Hood and I immediately hastened out of the building. What had happened? A whip-snake of the most venomous species lay on the ground, cut in 2 pieces by a rod which one of the natives held in his hand, just as it was darting at the colonel. The man was the one I had at first remarked, and his rapid intervention had certainly saved Sir Edward from immediate death, as we soon saw. The cry we had heard was uttered by another of the servants, who now lay on the grass in the agonies of death. By a deplorable fatality, the head of the snake, as it was severed from the body, had bounded against the unfortunate man's chest. Its fangs had entered him, and penetrated by the subtle poison. In less than a minute he was dead, all help proving unavailing. Rousing ourselves from the horror caused by this dreadful sight, we ran up to Colonel Munro. "You are not hurt?" exclaimed Banks, grasping his hand. "No, Banks, no. Make yourself easy," answered Sir Edward. Then, advancing towards the native, to whom he owed his life, "I thank you, friend," he said. The native made a sign as if to say that no thanks were necessary for that. "What is your name?" asked the colonel. "Karagani," answered the Hindu. End of Book 2, Chapter 2.